there and welcome back for our next video on APUS history. Today we are tackling topic 4.4b, America on the world stage, but specifically looking at diplomacy and American Indian removal. So we're still on learning objective D, explain how and why American foreign policy developed and expanded over time. In our last lesson, we looked at military actions and how those were part of American foreign policy. And now we'll be looking at other ways that the U.S. attempted to deal with other nations. So we're looking at this key concept about how the U.S. sought influence and control over the Western Hemisphere. And like I said, particularly looking at diplomacy, we're going to look at a couple examples regarding boundary disputes with Europeans, and then American Indian affairs, providing a little more background and examples. So to contextualize, we want to remember that in this time period, some historians have labeled it the era of good feelings. And while there certainly was sectionalism and rising tensions between the regions of the nation, we saw this most obviously through the Missouri Compromise, there were also just a general attitude of optimism, nationalism, especially after the War of 1812. And so by looking at two elections, the election of 1816 and the election of 1820, in both of these elections, James Monroe was elected easily as the Democratic Republican president. In 1816, this is the last election when the Federalists run a candidate. And in 1820, John Quincy Adams only earns one electoral vote. So both of these elections can be used as evidence to describe how this time does represent an era of good feelings. So what we see happening in this era during Monroe's presidency is one major political party, the Democratic Republicans. And one reason why they were able to maintain dominance is because they did adopt some Federalist measures. So ideas like tariffs, the national bank, internal improvements, all part of the American system that we'll talk about in our next lesson, and the maintenance of a large army and navy. These were ideas that Federalists supported. So the fact that the Democratic Republicans adopted these measures meant that they were seen as fine candidates to vote for in these elections. So let's take a look at diplomacy with Europeans. What we need to know is a little bit about John Quincy Adams. And while he did run for president in the 1820 election, he was Secretary of State for Monroe's presidency. He's been called a bulldog among Cocker Spaniels. He has some pretty impressive credentials for his position. Secretary of State deals with foreign affairs. And so when he was young, he traveled with his father, John Adams, to France and watched the diplomatic negotiations that happened in those years of the American Revolution. At just 14, he was the private secretary to the U.S. minister in Russia. And then for his father, he was the secretary during the Treaty of Paris, the end of the Revolutionary War. He was the minister resident to the Netherlands for Washington, the minister resident for Prussia for Adams, and then the minister to Russia, and then in the UK for Madison. So he has had a wealth of experience dealing with other countries. So one of the first major agreements that happens during his reign as Secretary of State is the Rush-Bagot Agreement. What this does is it settles some disputes in the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region. And so it's a pact with Great Britain. It furthers the peace that had been established after the War of 1812. It restrains border fortifications. It is a great example of how diplomacy can be used to solve issues instead of the military. Continuing on, the Convention or the Treaty of 1818 is again with Great Britain. So we're looking at the border between Canada and the United States in the West. And there were some agreements about Oregon that took place where the region could be jointly occupied for 10 years. They establish the 49th parallel as the boundary line. Once again, an example of diplomatic negotiations without the use of military action. Now, the Adams-Onis Treaty is different. Jackson had been ordered to help with some issues between the United States and Florida, specifically with the Seminoles, and he decided he had other plans. He decided to actually enter Florida and try to obtain Eastern Florida for the United States. And John Quincy Adams was able to negotiate a treaty with Spain to avoid war. So while there was some military action that had taken place, this treaty does avoid further war with Spain. And what happens in this war is that the claims to Florida and Oregon were turned over to the United States, and the U.S. assumed some of the Spanish debt and gave up their claims to Texas. And so now we see the boundary between the U.S. and Spain becoming even more clear. So here are 3 examples of how diplomacy was used to solve boundary disputes. Another example of diplomacy in this time period is the Monroe Doctrine. So some background to be aware of is that Europeans were still interested in colonizing the United States, but several nations in Central America especially had overthrown their colonizers. And the U.S. is, what would we say, sensitive or concerned about the continued European presence so close to our boundaries. And so Monroe, in an address to Congress, has this thing that ends up being called the Monroe Doctrine. And what he does is he warns Europe to stay out of the Americas. The Americas are closed for further colonization, and the United States will also stay neutral in European affairs. So basically, you stay out of our backyard, we'll stay out of your backyard. It was very nationalistic. It wasn't a huge impact at the time. It did kind of fuel a small sense of nationalism, like, oh, the U.S. is telling Europe what to do. We're telling them to stay out of the Americas. We're powerful enough. In reality, Europeans were just angered and annoyed and continued to kind of do what they wanted to do. Britain did back the Monroe Doctrine, and so there was a little fear that expansion into the Americas by countries like Spain could lead to conflict with Britain as well. But overall, the main impact of the Monroe Doctrine is that in the future, American leaders and presidents are going to use this as the precedent to justify further expansion into the Americas. So here's an excerpt from the Monroe Doctrine, which was in the 7th annual message to Congress. Monroe says, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Our policy in regard to Europe, which was adopted at an early stage of the wars, which have so long agitated that quarter of the globe, nevertheless remains the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of its powers. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves in hope that other powers will pursue the same course. So we have endeavored to stay neutral in European affairs. We will continue to do that. Now we are asking that Europe follow that same policy. So you can sense a little bit of that isolationist rhetoric that began with Washington's presidency. So political cartoons of the Monroe Doctrine are abundant, and many of them are referenced again, especially during the Age of Imperialism with Teddy Roosevelt. So here's one called Keep Off, the Monroe Doctrine Must Be Respected. So Uncle Sam is there, protecting, if you will, the countries in Central and Southern America, and European countries are looking on with annoyance and anger. Here's another one where European countries are in a chicken coop, and the Monroe Doctrine has blocked them in. You have other countries of Central and Southern America that are, roaming free. And Europe is saying to Uncle Sam the rooster, saying, "You're not the only rooster in South America." And Uncle Sam says, "I was aware of that when I cooped you up." So this is potentially a bit of a stretch, thinking that the Monroe Doctrine really did keep the European powers out of the Americas, but you can sense the symbolism, the nationalist rhetoric here. So let's move on to our next concept where we're looking at American Indian affairs. So there's some pretty essential background that is helpful for understanding. And the first is looking at the Hopewell Treaties. These are a few treaties that were established between American Indians and the U.S. that were considered to be fairly respectfully negotiated, diplomatically addressed between American leaders and American Indian leaders. And the U.S. recognized native sovereignty in Western lands as a result of these treaties and established a diplomatic approach. Then we see the Louisiana Purchase happening in 1803, further expanding U.S. territory. The War of 1812 had some major ramifications for American Indians, as many American Indians had actually sided with the British during the war. And military actions by Harrison and Jackson end up further opening up certain lands to American expansion. And then, of course, the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819 that we just talked about further opened up Florida to American expansion. So we see this series of treaties at the start and then expansionary measures. And so obviously things are changing between the relationships between American Indians and the U.S. And especially if you live in these areas, there are some significant local histories that are super helpful for understanding these changes. I've chosen to look at just two. So first, we have a major battle led by Jackson. It's most often called Horseshoe Bend in 1814. So Jackson takes 3,300 men and attacks a little over 1,000 Red Stick Creek warriors. And over 800 of the warriors, plus women and children, will be savagely killed. This is going to end Creek resistance to American expansion, because as a result of this massive attack, there is the Treaty of Fort Jackson, where the Creek end up ceding 23 million acres of land. You can see on this map, we're just looking at a very small region of the southern present-day United States, and you can see a series of treaties and the lands that were ceded. You can see how many acres of land were transferred between groups. Another really significant turning point in the relationship between American Indians and the United States government is at Doak's Stand in 1820. So this is where some Choctaw Indians met with Jackson. Jackson was not president, he was a general at the time, and he invited the Choctaw to relinquish their land claims. So either they can remain sovereign, autonomous American Indian tribes, but they must move west if they want to do that, or they will remain in the east and basically lose their tribal sovereignty. And in these negotiations, Jackson refuses to follow some of the subscribed cultural norms that had been in place. He also he references the American Indians as children. For example, he says the president expects no difficulties with his Choctaw children. So very paternalistic here. The Choctaw do not agree on how to handle the situation here with Jackson, but eventually there is the Treaty of Doak's Stand, where they cede 5 million plus acres to the U.S. And this really represents, like I said, a turning point in both the rhetoric and diplomatic negotiations that occur. It is much more one-sided and forceful and less amenable to American Indians. So I hope that this was a good example, or provided good examples for you of how the U.S. used both diplomacy and American Indian removal in their foreign policy. These concepts are going to continue on. We'll continue talking about American Indian removal, especially when we talk about Jackson later in this unit. So I hope that this lesson, like I said, was helpful for you. And if so, please like and subscribe.